Welcome to the PR in Lockdown podcast, your guide to PR and communications in a post-lockdown world, produced by Access Studios in collaboration with the PRCA. I'm Rob Double, and in this episode, I'm talking to Gus Sellitto, co-founder and managing director at Byfield Consultancy. We're looking at communications in the legal sector. From reputation management, internal communications, and litigation PR, Gus brings in-depth insight into managing the extraordinary comms challenges for all law firms throughout the pandemic. Gus, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
Good to be with you, Rob.
So just give us an overview of Byfield Consulting. What are you about, and what are the main things that you, historically at least, have been doing?
We founded Byfield Consultancy 13 years ago, Rob. It's a specialist legal sector communications consultancy. It's a niche we chose because my co-founder and I had significant experience of working with the legal sector, not only to promote law firms as businesses and as you would in any sort of other corporate PR setting, but also acting for law firm clients who are involved in crisis situations and, as you said, litigation PR, which is a specialist branch of legal PR, and clearly something we're likely to see more of a demand for as a result of the current pandemic.
So that's interesting. I mean, already you're talking about how the legal sector and the comms challenges around that might be changing. But if we just go back to the first few months of lockdown, those first few weeks, what was the experience like for you? And I suppose specifically, what was the experience like for you within the legal sector?
We had the benefit of, we started Byfield Consultancy in 2007. A year later, we had a major financial crash. So we'd had that experience of going through a previous recession and coming through it relatively strongly. The legal sector is pretty resilient, actually, when it comes to downturns in the economy. That there's that old saying that you always need a lawyer. And actually, it's true. Unfortunately, as a result of these kinds of crises we're seeing now, you do have more of a demand for certain areas of law, like employment law, lots of redundancies going on, bankruptcy and restructuring. And of course, as we saw from the last downturn, there is a lot more litigation that happens as a result of a crisis situation. So there will be more of a demand for litigation as well. So as an industry, the law is pretty resilient, and we're seeing that throughout lockdown. It has been impacted. All businesses have been impacted, but lawyers and law firms are pretty resilient in terms of being able to pivot their services into those areas that are seeing increasing demand for legal services.
And so it almost sounds, as you said, whilst there was disruption, it sounds like for you and Byfield Consultancy, the lockdown period, for all the unfortunate reasons, as you've just mentioned, has actually had quite a busy time.
80% of our revenue is still retained revenue. Like a lot of other PR businesses, you try and build a business which is around core retained revenue. And that certainly took a hit, as most PR retainers took a hit. We immediately had clients saying, we need to lower our monthly retainer fee, or we need to take a pause. And that had an immediate impact on our revenues. And we had to really look at readjusting what was a very ambitious forecast going into our new financial year to deal with a post-lockdown environment.
Was that ambitious? Was that, as you said, ambitious forecast? Was that as a result of very good growth in previous years, leading up to this year, and so you thought, that kind of acceleration would be continuing?
Yeah, we had a solid 2 years of growth, and we really wanted to set an ambitious target for this financial year coming. So from May this year into May next year was a very ambitious target, and we had to essentially rip that up and say, actually, if we can sustain what we did last year, that would be a really good outcome. So retained revenue was certainly hit and continues to be impacted, but we have seen more of a demand for crisis PR and litigation PR for sure.
I'd be quite interested to talk about the idea of leadership communications and also crisis PR, particularly over the last few months, because it's been done very differently by a lot of different companies to success and failure. In the legal sector, do you see that there have been leadership communications that have gone wrong over the period, and what particularly do you think were the things that some companies got wrong in that period?
We've just done a study with the London Business School, which looked at the top 6 things keeping law firm leaders up at night and the communication challenges that are attached to those issues. And leadership communications was certainly something that came up as a key concern. One of the really interesting debates that is ongoing is how and when to break bad news and how also to balance that with good news. So, at a time when salaries are being cut, people are being asked to work shorter hours or shorter working weeks, at a time when new recruits have been frozen, how do you give that news in a way which doesn't alarm people, but isn't sugar coated in the same way so as to give them false hope? At the same time, it's not all doom and gloom. I heard listening to some of your previous guests who are actually seeing some upticks in work, and that's true of certain areas of law firms as well. So how do you then impart that good news whilst you're having to impart this bad news? And that's a really fine balancing act, and particularly when these things are being done over Zoom, that whole presentation style, being able to read the feedback you're getting back virtually, there's a real art to that.
And what about you personally, as the MD of Byfield Consultancy? You mentioned the loss, particularly the retained income, did have an effect. I think you mentioned as well that there have been some furloughs within the team, some furloughing within the team. And how did it impact you as the manager of the consultancy? And also, what were your priorities in those first few months? How did you steer the team through that very, very tricky period?
Well, I think the first priority was to make sure that everybody was safe. And that meant moving from an office-based environment to a remote environment, setting everybody up with the right technology, and just checking in with the team at a very human level about, did they have the right setup? Were they okay? What kind of concerns did they have?
Was there kind of like an audit you did right at the beginning when you realised the transition that was going to need to happen?
We did it very much as a collaborative communication. So we always had a daily team meeting where we go through the newspapers and discuss the issues of the day, and that's really helped to keep that ongoing communication going, albeit now done on Zoom. One of the surprises, one of the positives that has come out of this is actually, I think our internal communication has improved and will continue to do so. Even as a small agency with 14 people, we're finding actually that need to communicate has become heightened. And so we're planning more internal communication around key business decisions we're having to make. And at the same time, being able to involve staff more in those decisions and how they're impacted by them. And we're actually seeing really positive benefits from that.
Were there any other, I suppose, challenges or maybe more unexpected surprises or things that you didn't anticipate, but you realised during lockdown was happening? I mean, I assume one of the big challenges you had potentially as a legal PR firm was about ensuring security within a cloud-based system, when obviously in an office papers and stuff are a lot more secure and things are in one central place. I mean, what were the real things or the key things that you had to grapple with during those first few months?
Yeah, I think security is very important in relation to what we do. So there are simple measures you can make in relation to that. Password protecting documents more and more. So double authentication on entry into, particularly when you're working remotely. We are constantly looking at tightening up those processes. When I do need to actually print and scan big documents, I will go back into the office and enjoy being back in the office actually to do those kinds of tasks. And also, doing a lot more. Microsoft Teams has been a bit of a revelation to me. We're actually doing more communication through that. And the good old picking up the telephone where you've got really sensitive issues to discuss, using WhatsApp a lot more. So in terms of the challenges, I've been actually surprised at how well we've been able to adapt to much more of a remote environment, including managing issues around security and keeping in touch and discussing those really tricky cases and client issues we have. And of course, a lot of that would have been done over the telephone anyway with clients. So that hasn't really changed.
We're going to take a very, very quick break now, but coming up, we'll be discussing how to tackle this transition from lockdown into the new normal, and also what the challenges are that we might see going forwards in the legal PR industry in particular. We were talking quite extensively before the break about what you've been doing, at least during that immediate lockdown period, but looking forwards now, what are the kind of things you're doing to keep the team buoyant, to keep the team invested and focused, particularly as the coming few months are still full of such uncertainty in so many areas of PR and comms?
Well, one of the things we did immediately during lockdown, Rob, was we became really, really much more focused on the numbers. So we started having a weekly we called it a mini Cobra meeting, and that involved our non-exec chairman and a business advisor we've been working with for a few years, who had a very successful PR business in the 80s and 90s, and now advises a number of leading PR agencies. So we're very lucky to have that leadership team around us, and I've really lent very heavily on that leadership team. And essentially what we've done every week is had a laser sharp focus on the numbers: cash flow, aged debtors, new business projects, more so than we've ever had, even in a small agency where cash flow is king in all businesses. But that's really helped us to really focus on ensuring client service remains, beyond any time that we've run the agency, a real focus, and having a laser sharp focus on the opportunities that are coming in, which have been much reduced, but also those areas of our business where we need to put more focus in. What we've also done, very importantly, is when I talked about reducing our forecast for the year, we looked at what our monthly income levels need to be. And we did have to make reductions in salary as a result of the reductions we'd suffered in the first 2 or 3 months of the pandemic. And staff were very understanding that they would have to take a pay cut. But at the same time, we quickly realized that people were working even harder than they normally work. So we wanted to try and come up with an incentive which helped all of us to be really focused on the numbers and what we had to do on a month-to-month basis. So we communicated to the team that every month we needed to make X amount in order to make a small profit, not the profit that we'd initially anticipated. And that if we could all really focus on making that number, we'd all receive 100% of our salary. And that's been a really good exercise in helping the team to become more financially savvy about running a small business. And when I say the team, I mean everybody throughout the organization, at the senior level and the more junior and entry level, including the new recruits who have come on board. And I think that's given us all more of a focus on what success looks like from a financial perspective. And again, that's been a pleasant learning and a useful learning that's come out of the lockdown experience. So now, for example, we are doing more training on upselling, spotting new opportunities, financial management, how to read the numbers. And people are really interested in learning more about that and how they can contribute. So that's been a real positive that's come from this, and certainly something that we will continue as we come out of the current situation.
Yeah, I think that's a really good description of how that transparency and being open with teams has been a very rewarding experience and positive experience for everyone. And you mentioned how it was met with positivity from the team and got them involved in kind of the business mechanics and understanding that as well. You mentioned there about finding new opportunities, and we chatted about the uptick in crisis PR and litigation PR and things like that during lockdown. What are the kind of areas, particularly within your field of legal PR and legal communications, where you see there being, opportunities for the consultancy, for yourselves, particularly in the next sort of 2, 3, 4 months?
certainly in those two areas, crisis and litigation. Small c crises, around how law firms continue to deal with the communication around the pandemic, and I call that a small c crisis, not to downplay this, but we're all going through this now, and I think there's a lot of collective learning that's going on. So there still needs to be some management around that. But the more big C crises, again, what came out of our survey is certainly law firm leaders are very worried still about things like data breaches, and in an increasingly remote environment, those data breaches are an increasing risk factor. More broadly, in terms of PR and comms, I think there's clearly been more of a push to digital and online content, but there's also, I think, much more of a focus, and we've been seeing this in the last few years in PR and communications, around reputation and the importance of a strong reputation, and how a strong reputation, particularly when you go through the kind of crisis we're all experiencing now, can really be the glue that holds your brand and your company together. So an opportunity coming out of this for the PR industry as a whole is actually how important reputation is, how tied it is to culture, how internal communications is so important as the vehicle to drive that culture, and how leadership communications is tied to that. And so for the industry as a whole, as much as there's a huge amount of doom and gloom, uh, there are, I think, there will be opportunities to continue to promote PR as a really important strategic business function for preserving and managing reputation.
And in terms of the legal PR sector, you mentioned how, the retained clients, there was a dip for you during lockdown. How long do you anticipate the legal sector, and particularly your business, I suppose, to be disrupted? I mean, are you looking in things of, there will continue to be disruption for the coming year or until the end of this year? What's your judgment on that?
Oh, I wish I had that crystal ball that gave me the right answers to that question, Rob. It's very much dependent on, do we have a second lockdown? How do we deal with the current spikes that we're seeing? And if those don't manifest, will we start to see more of a return to, certainly not business as normal, but a kind of uh, a recovery starting to happen? I do think that as long as you keep doing the right things and keep your people safe and happy as much as you can, and keep your clients happy as much as you can, and also look at those tried and tested old marketing methods. I remember when we first started the PR agency, what really worked. What really worked was having conversations with contacts, old and new, and going through your LinkedIn again, and checking, checking in on some of those older contacts, going back to basics in many ways, that referral marketing, picking up the phone, and most importantly, making sure that your current clients are okay, I think is a priority over big, new, shiny marketing initiatives. It's that sort of that older, what's worked in the past, what worked when we first started the consultancy, how do we win business then? And that sort of power of just some of the tried and tested methods over going out there and trying to embark on a big new marketing campaign in an environment which is quite new for everybody.
So let's just talk very quickly about you and Byfield Consultancy. What are your real priorities coming out of lockdown, coming out into this transition of this new working life? Obviously the actual working patterns of office versus virtual is one key component, but what are the key priorities for you as the managing director of the team, particularly for the next, let's say, 3, 4, 5 months?
Well, the gradual return to a part office existence for us is going to be really important. It's going to be a hybrid.
So you're going to go on a hybrid model of 2-3 days in and working from home the rest of the time.
Yeah, that's very much the survey we did with our team quite early on, in relation to return to work was not so much that they didn't want to come back to the office. They all do, but there's concerns clearly about travelling on public transport, etc. So we're in no rush, but we've got a trial period at the moment where people can come in up to 2 days a week. That just started actually just last week. That will continue till the end of September. It's completely voluntary. For example, I'm going in 2 days a week just because I like that separation between home and office. We are a people business. I think for all the benefits of remote working, and it's worked extremely well. People do want to come and interact with their team. They would like to see clients again. There's that whole cultural piece, which is so important to continue to preserve and build that culture, and that comes from some face-to-face contact.
You mentioned about how there's the person-to-person interaction is so important. Let's just very quickly look and gaze into the crystal ball about the long-term impacts that this whole period will have, particularly on the legal sector and legal communication sector as a whole. One of the areas is, from my understanding at least, the legal sector and legal PR, there is a very strong relationship, person-to-person conversation aspect to it, and traveling around and talking to people and having those face-to-face meetings is very important. How do you think the legal sector and your job is going to change in the long term as a result of this? Do you think it will snap back to normal as soon as it can, or do you think there are going to be some changes?
I think the biggest change comes in, and the chairman, chief exec of PwC has talked about this a lot, this notion that we all have to be in an office and have to meet face to face to be able to do business is actually not correct. And I think the law, very much as a people profession, a service profession, has been very much focused on we need that sort of office face to face contact, and PR is, I would say, very much the same. But certainly, I think moving forward, it is going to be much more of a hybrid version. I think people have seen the personal benefits of being able to work from home and spend more time with their families, not have to commute, and the whole rush hour issue. So I think we will see what will be a very workable hybrid system. You will come in for important client meetings. We've certainly done Zoom pitches and presentations. I don't think they work quite as well, particularly when it's a new business pitch and you haven't met those people before. So I think we will, when it's safe to do so, come in for those kinds of presentations. We'll certainly come in for big team meetings. We'll certainly come in where there's a piece of work that requires collaboration on a face-to-face level. And I think other companies will do the same, and other industries the same, and the law will be the same. And where there are those very sensitive conversations that need to happen between law firms and their clients, then they will do those in a more socially distanced way. But I think it will be very reflective of what we're seeing when you walk down your local high street and when you come into the city now. Things are returning to normal, but it's a different kind of normal. So, I went into a shoe shop yesterday. I put my mask on. The chap helped me, out of the box and put gloves on to take the shoes out of the box. So the transaction still happened, but it happened with some different new ways of doing it. And I think that's going to be very much the way that we continue to do business in the future.
It's that cliche phrase, isn't it? The new normal, which I've heard so much, but it is a reality. It is a new normal way of doing things. Gus, if people want to get in touch with you, both personally, but also to Byfield Consultancy, what's the best way for them to do that?
Website, www.byfieldconsultancy.com, and drop me an email, gus@byfieldconsultancy.com. Be very happy to hear from you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for joining us on this episode, Gus. And thanks very much to all of those who are listening and watching. Don't forget, this is an ongoing series. So if you like what you're listening and watching, please do subscribe to us and rate us on your preferred podcast library, or on YouTube. Just search PR in Lockdown and you'll see us right there. Thanks very much for listening. We'll see you again on the next episode. PR in Lockdown is presented by Rob Double, and the guest this episode was Gus Sellitto, co-founder and managing director at Byfield Consultancy. It is created by Access Studios in collaboration with the PRCA.